Former Vice President Joe Biden continues to lead President Donald Trump by a steady margin in the national polls for president. However, the Biden campaign insists they're leaving no stone unturned in order to ensure what happened in 2016 doesn't rear its ugly head again. Biden faces a consequential decision. Who is he going to pick as his vice presidential running mate? Does he have to pick an African-American woman of color in order to heal the open wounds of the nation and begin again? And who's the most competent, capable, and intriguing choice? Sam Stein is the political editor for the Daily Beast. He joined me this week to review Biden's vice presidential options and to provide his perspective on some other national political headlines. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. So, Sam, when we look at the upcoming election, from the coronavirus pandemic to the economy to the civil unrest that's currently going on around the country, there will be certainly a lot of issues on the minds of voters this November. So I'm wondering if I can start you off with, which one of those three issues do you think will be most prevalent on the minds of voters this November as they head to the polls?
That's a great question. It's tough to know what people will be talking about in 4 months' time, let alone 4 days. But if you look at the trajectory of how the United States is handling the coronavirus pandemic, it does not give one a lot of confidence that this issue is going to go away, as much as everyone wishes it would just go away. We are in the midst of experiencing a fairly scary uptick in cases in almost all the states across our country, but most predominantly in the South and Southwest. We don't have much political will remaining to lock everyone back up in their homes so that we can stop the spread of this virus, which means that this will likely continue to spread in our communities, and this will only likely grow worse as the fall comes, because people will head back indoors where the virus spreads more easily. And so if you have a crystal ball, all this means is it's shaping up for a situation where right around election time, we will be still in the midst of this pandemic with the potential for things to be on the uptick. We will have a still difficult economic situation related to the fact that businesses can't open or can't open fully because of the pandemic. And whilst kids may be going back to school in our country, there's a strong likelihood that the schools themselves will have to either shut down because of virus scares, or that they will have to do more remote learning. So basically massive disruptions in the daily lives of voters right before Election Day, which means that I think, to answer your question, I think coronavirus will likely play the biggest role heading into November at the top of voters' minds.
Do you think that the lack of a national response will hurt the president come Election Day?
Yes. It's already hurting him right now by any conceivable metric. His approval ratings for the handling of the coronavirus pandemic have gone consistently lower and lower. Now, there is always a portion of this country that is completely committed to Donald Trump and will stick with him through a lot of this, if not all of this. And they can rationalize his response, and they can point to things that they say paint his response in a positive light. But the truth of the matter is that the majority of the country thinks he's done a very poor job. They've been turned off by how he's handled it, and they look at sort of the top-line statistics, and they say the United States is faring as bad, if not worse, than any other country in the world at this, and leadership starts at the top, and Donald Trump's at the top.
And turning to Joe Biden, I'm just wondering your thoughts on the process to pick his vice president. Certainly there's been a lot of groundswell to pick an African-American woman. He said he's going to pick a woman as his running mate. I'm just wondering, do you believe that he has to pick a African-American woman to help sort of heal the open wounds of the nation at this point?
That's a really good question. I think the easy answer would be yes. That it would be an incredible symbol and a nod to the African American community if there was a African American running mate. I think the more complicated answer is that it might not matter as much as people think. If you look at public opinion surveys of African American voters, while they may be sentimentally attached to the notion, they're not going to not vote if the nominee for vice president is white. Joe Biden has promised to pick a female vice president. He also has promised to pick an African American woman for a seat on the Supreme Court if a vacancy opens up. And it's almost certain that a vacancy will open up if he is elected. So he's made these nods already. I think he's earned some kudos for it. But I don't think necessarily that he has to pick an African-American woman for his vice presidential nominee as a matter of course. I think it would send an amazing signal. I think it would be politically and morally appropriate. But I'm not sure it's the elixir, for instance, that would guarantee his election.
Now, the people he's considering, I'm just wondering your opinion on who do you think is the most intriguing for the job, and who do you think he'll ultimately pick?
I can't give you a prediction on who he'll pick because I will choose someone and then I will be wrong and I'll be humiliated by how wrong I've been. But I will tell you, the people who are at the top of the list are Senator Kamala Harris of California. She's an African American senator, was a presidential nominee. Younger, dynamic, a future of the party type person. There's also Elizabeth Warren, who is the senator from Massachusetts, also was a presidential nominee. She's more of liberal minded. She could, seal up Biden standing among the base. She's not generationally different than Biden, so we have a very old Democratic ticket if she were chosen. Then there's Val Demings, who is a representative from Florida. She's a member of the House. She was once the police chief in Orlando. Generationally, quite different than Biden, African-American woman with law enforcement background. And then the most recent name that's been floated a lot is Senator Tammy Duckworth, who is a senator from Illinois, decorated war veteran, double amputee. Both her legs were lost in Iraq when she was serving there. And she is a minority. Her nationality is Thai, and she has an impressive resume in addition to being, the United States senator. So, all these people have great attributes that they can bring to the ticket. I think the choice Biden has to face is twofold. One, who do you think is the weakest part of your coalition? If he looks at it and he says, I need to get progressive Democrats to rally to my candidacy because I'm worried that they don't necessarily view me as one of their own, they're upset that Bernie Sanders lost, then he might be inclined to choose Elizabeth Warren. If he wants to make a nod to, this moment in history when racial justice is at the forefront of our political conversation, then perhaps a Val Demings would make sense in that case. If it's a generational argument, and he has been upfront saying he wants to be a bridge to a future generation, then we're looking more at someone like Tammy Duckworth or Kamala Harris, who are young 50s senators who represent the future of the Democratic Party, compared to, let's say, a Warren or a Biden.
Now, do you think Biden's empathetic nature will help him at all draw voters in November? Because I think when you look at this election, it's a choice between the status quo and keeping things the same versus trying to bridge the narrative, because as we've seen, President Trump isn't exactly the most empathetic person in the world. So I'm just wondering, do you think empathy will help Joe Biden in November?
Another really good question. It's funny because when Barack Obama was president, he was quoted as saying that he wanted a Supreme Court justice who was empathetic. And his opponents, Obama's opponents, used that against him as saying, we don't need, people in that position to be empathetic. We need them to understand the law and apply it. So empathy has been used as a bad thing in politics before. I think we're in a vastly different place now. My general theory is that elections like this tend to be reactive to what is going on in the current moment. And by that I mean that people gravitate towards someone who is the polar opposite of the person in power. And so part of the reason I think Donald Trump was elected in the first place is that he represented a complete break and change from Barack Obama. And I think one of the things that Joe Biden has working for him is precisely the fact that he embodies this empathetic type of politics, this idea that you can care about people, that you can want to understand the opposition and work with the opposition, that there's nothing unmanly or unpatriotic or problematic about showing empathy and compassion. And I think people in this day and age are probably thirsting for that a lot more than they were, let's say, 5 years ago. And so I do think it is an advantage to Biden, and I think his team understands that because they constantly emphasize that he has an empathetic streak in all of their advertisements and all of the arguments that they make against Trump. So I think they view it as an advantage too.
Now, as you and I both know that seniors will vote in large numbers in this election, so I'm wondering your thoughts on the way that the president has sort of treated that demographic and whether it'll cost him come election day in November.
You said seniors, right?
Seniors, that's correct, yeah.
Yeah. So, traditionally, seniors are the most likely people to vote in presidential elections, in any elections, really. And more often than not, but not all the time, they lean Republican. In this case, what we've seen is a real gravitation away from Trump among the older voter demographic. And people are trying to figure out exactly why that is the case. One of the explanations is simply that his handling of the coronavirus pandemic has been, particularly problematic for older generations who are much more likely to have severe consequences from contracting the disease. And they look at this and they say, well, why should we support someone who couldn't protect us? It's a visceral reaction to Trump. I also think he has a style of politics that is not necessarily, comfortable for that demographic. It might be for, younger seniors, the 50 to 65 range. But I think over that age, people are sort of, find it all very peculiar that there's a president who can't seem to stop tweeting and engaging in culture wars and, calling, his opponents any number of sort of vicious nicknames. I find they probably find that a little bit off-putting. And then the last thing is that Joe Biden is just sort of like, an easy person to latch on to in that sense. He's not, first of all, he's old. He's 77 years old. Secondly, he's been around. He's a known quantity. They're familiar with him. Thirdly, and I don't think this can be, dismissed, is he's a white male. And in a country that has obvious issues with race, but also has had a history of, issues electing female candidates, this is a vessel that they're comfortable with. And then finally, he's not a radical like the Trump campaign wants to portray him to be. He's an established guy whose centrist politics aren't off-putting for seniors like Bernie Sanders may have been. So, all those make it easy for them to cross over and abandon Trump. And I think if Trump is to go on and lose the election, it's probably going to be because he bled support from seniors over these summer months.
Now, just to follow up on that, assuming Trump loses in November, how do you think his presidency will ultimately be defined?
Man, I don't know. It's really tough to say. A lot of it obviously depends on where we are in the stage of fighting the coronavirus pandemic and the accompanying damage to the economy that it causes. From a legacy standpoint, Trump's main legacy will be that he reshaped the courts in America. He's gotten 200 largely conservative, those not exclusively conservative judges confirmed to positions in this country. So that legacy will be with America for decades to come. And, you cannot just simply dismiss that. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that the policies he's pursued and enacted have largely come up short. Much of what he's done has been through executive orders, which are basically presidential directives that can be reversed by his his successors. So there's not much, permanency to that. And I think, people will look back and say, wow, he presided over, just a completely botched response to a global pandemic that resulted in, we're at 130,000 right now in America dead. We're looking at, 3 million infected, and, dozens of millions of, jobs lost. I mean, there's not many good ways to spin that if he loses in November. If he gets 4 more years to change the course, that's a different question. But, I just feel like if he loses in November, people will look back and say, this was not a success story. It was, a story of, bumbling failure even.
Yeah, I've got 2 more questions for you, and then
Sure.
The first one has to do, we saw that the vice president held a news conference yesterday announcing the Trump administration's desire to reopen schools. I'm just wondering your thoughts on that debate and having kids back in the classroom. And I know you have children as well, so I'm wondering your thoughts on how Americans will perceive the need to get their kids back into school versus keeping them safe as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have a 7-month-old who's not going to school anytime soon, but I also have a 3.5-year-old who is in pre-kindergarten. And, obviously this affects me on a personal level, like anyone who has kids. And, what's frustrating, I suppose, about this is that this is a issue with incredible complexities and emotional baggage. Speaking as a human being and not a reporter here, I'm conflicted about this. I want my son to, get the benefits of, that come with pre-kindergarten, whether it's educational or social, or just being around, people who are his age to, learn the things that he needs to learn about interaction. I want all that. At the same time, I recognize that there's risk involved in this, not just for my kid, but for the teachers who have to be there, for the staff at the school, and, for, anyone who gets around these kids who could be vectors for the disease. So with that as a backdrop, it's interesting to see this distilled into this incredible sort of debate about absolutely either you are for closing the schools or you're for putting them completely open. And that's what Trump has done. He said, we're either going to open the schools entirely or we're not going to do it at all. And I just find that that's a debate that is a fake debate. I mean, there's got to be ways to do this, with some nuance. And it just sort of exemplifies Trump's style, and I think maybe the pitfalls of it really well, which is, someone who put more thought into the issue might say, okay, we're going to try to do things differently than in the past. We're going to try to give schools the resources they need to make sure that they have, the public health guidelines, the infrastructure to make sure that kids are safe. Trump doesn't think like that. He wants people to just go back to school and then, incur the risks. And I think, parents across the country probably look at this and say, that doesn't make me totally comfortable, and I wish you wouldn't push so hard.
Yeah, and my final question for you is, I'm just wondering if you can define for me this current time politically in America and how we should perceive it at this time.
It's a really difficult time in America. I remember being around during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. This was when the Iraq War was going poorly, and then we had one of America's great cities, submerged in floodwater with people dying and the government unable to help them. And I thought back then that was a really dark time in American history. I remember reporting as our stock market collapsed in September of 2007 amid this presidential contest. People were losing their life savings. It felt like bottomless almost in terms of the economy. That was a dark time too. And this I feel like is comparable in terms of its, in terms of just sort of the darkness of the moment we're in, where it feels like we are all just sort of stuck in the system in which we don't know how we're going to emerge from this pandemic without severe human damage. And not just in the immediate term, but in the long term too. I mean, people are going to lose, they've lost their jobs, they're going to lose struggling, they're going to have to risk their personal health. We're going to have educational issues that stem from this. And it just doesn't feel like our politics is up to the task right now. And so, covering American politics right now it's like a weird, dark, compelling, and emotional story that you're just sort of trying to figure out how to explain and wrap your head around. I love it as a journalist. Don't get me wrong. Professionally, it's fascinating. But as a human being, you can't separate the two sometimes. As a human being, it's a little bit scary.
Hey, Sam, we want to take a few seconds to thank you for providing your insights and analysis on some political issues that are important to many Americans. I want to thank you for your time and have a great day, okay?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on the show.